He didn't wake her. That was the first mistake. Everything that came after was the second. The rain had been falling since Tuesday. Iris knew this because she had been sleeping in her car since Tuesday, wedged between a duffel bag that held everything she still owned and a phone that had stopped pretending it had battery 2 days ago. She knew the exact sound rain made on a car roof when it stopped being background noise and started being the only sound left in the world. She knew the particular cold that crept in through old door seals at 2 a.m. She knew what it felt like to be completely, utterly out of options. What she did not know, could not have known, was that Mrs. Gable would recognize her. She had been a gardener at Thornfield Estate for 2 seasons before the property sold. Not a grand position, not a memorable one. She talked to the roses when she thought no one was listening. "You're doing beautifully. Don't mind the frost," and kept her head down and her hands in the soil and asked nothing of anyone. Apparently, Mrs. Gable had been listening. The knock on her car window came at midnight. A small woman in a wool cardigan, holding an umbrella like a weapon, peering in at Iris with an expression caught somewhere between pity and outrage. Iris cracked the window. "You're the Rose girl," Mrs. Gable said, not a question. Yes, I used to work next door. I didn't mean to park so close to the— How long have you been out here?" Iris hesitated. Mrs. Gable's expression settled firmly into outrage. "Come inside. Now. I won't have it." "I can't. I don't know who lives here. I shouldn't just— He's not home until midnight, and it's already past that, so we're losing time. Move, child." The house was warm. That was the first thing Iris noticed. Not the ceilings, though they were high enough to make her feel small. Not the stone floors or the dark wood paneling, or the portraits watching from the hallway walls with expressions suggesting they didn't approve of visitors arriving in wet clothes at this hour. Just the warmth. Rolling toward her from somewhere deep inside the building, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and old stone and something that might have been soup. Mrs. Gable steered her through the entrance hall with the efficiency of a woman who had navigated this house for decades, and the specific route she chose, Iris noticed, was deliberate. Left at the main corridor, not right. Away from the heavy oak door at the far end of the hall where the light underneath it was still on. Away from the staircase that led, presumably, to the upper floors. Iris glanced back once. 2 men stood outside that far door. Not staff, not groundskeepers. They stood the way men stood when standing still was part of the job, weight balanced, hands loose, watching everything, including her. She looked away before they caught her looking. "Don't wander," Mrs. Gable had said in the car. Not like a courtesy, like a rule. She was beginning to understand the difference. The sitting room off the main hall was everything the rest of the house had hinted at. Fireplace, deep couches, curtains that cost more than a month of her former rent. A blanket folded over the arm of the nearest couch that had never, she suspected, been unfolded in its life. "Sit," Mrs. Gable said. Iris sat. "Soup first, sleep after." Already moving. "Don't touch anything. Don't wander." A pause at the door. "And if you hear the front door, don't panic." "Why would I?" "Because he sounds like a storm coming in, and it startles people the first time." Said with the breezy practicality of someone describing a drafty window. "You'll be fine." She was gone before Iris could ask who he was. The soup was extraordinary. Iris ate it slowly, watching the fire, feeling the cold finally leave her bones in slow degrees. She hadn't realized how tired she was until the warmth hit her all at once like a wave pressing her down into the cushions. She would just rest her eyes, just for a moment, just until Mrs. Gable came back, just— Silas Voss had sent his men to the perimeter at 10. Standard protocol when he wanted the house quiet. Skeleton crew on the grounds, 2 at the study door, Everyone else pulled back behind the gate. He'd been running Ashworth Manor as both home and headquarters for 6 years, and the rhythm of it was as automatic as breathing. Lock the east corridor, clear the residential wing, check the feeds. He checked them now from the back seat of the car. 3 screens on his phone, 16 cameras, every angle of every entrance, and found nothing unusual. Good. He needed the quiet tonight. He needed the particular silence of a house that wasn't waiting for him to make another decision. The meeting had run long. It always ran long when the other party arrived with something to prove. He'd listened for 2 hours and said 30 words, and let the weight of those 30 words do what it always did. Settle into the room like stone into water, slow and inevitable and impossible to retrieve. 1 problem resolved, 2 more waiting for morning. He put the phone away as the car turned through the gates. The driver, Marco, 22 years, never asked unnecessary questions, slowed at the entrance and said nothing. Silas stepped out. 2 of his men materialized from the darkness beside the door, fell into flanking positions, followed him to the threshold. He stopped, held up one hand. They stopped. He looked at them, then at the door, then at something only he had caught, a light in the sitting room window that shouldn't have been on. A look passed between him and Marco. Marco gave the smallest nod. Handled, under control, not a threat. Silas held his gaze for 1 beat longer than necessary. Then he turned to the 2 men at his flanks. "Night," he said. They dissolved back into the dark. He went inside alone. He found her 3 steps into the entrance hall. He didn't need to go far. The sitting room door was half open, the fire still going, the lamp on the side table casting a low gold light across the couch. And on the couch, he stopped. She was small, curled on her side with one hand tucked beneath her chin and the other hanging loose off the edge of the cushion, fingers just grazing the floor. Dark hair fanned against the pale fabric. The soup bowl on the table beside her was empty. The blanket had slipped to her waist. She was deeply, completely, defenselessly asleep. Silas stood in the doorway and did not move. He had built an entire life on the premise that nothing got past him. 16 cameras, 23 men, walls inside walls inside walls, each one earned through the specific education of losing something he hadn't protected carefully enough. He had learned, had made himself learn, that the only things worth having were the things you could secure. He looked at her. She had gotten past all of it by falling asleep. He had walked into rooms where men twice his size had stopped breathing. He had sat across tables from people who would have paid handsomely to see him in the ground. He had, on 2 separate occasions, ended conversations that needed ending without raising his voice or his hands. He had never once, in the course of any of it, felt the particular stillness that settled over him now. She didn't know where she was. That was obvious. She didn't know whose house she was in, whose couch she was on, what happened in the rooms she'd been steered away from. She had eaten the soup and fallen asleep in front of the fire with the specific surrender of someone who had been running on empty for too long and had finally, without planning to, found somewhere her body decided was safe enough to let go. His eyes moved down to her hands. The calluses, faint but certain, across her palms and the inside of her fingers. Not the hands of someone who had ever been given anything easily. The hands of someone who worked, who tended, who stayed with things. A girl this soft shouldn't have hands that know hard work. The thought arrived without invitation. He let it pass. What he did, without quite deciding to, was reach over and pull the blanket up. Then he stood there 1 beat longer than he should have, because the fire had burned low, and in the low light she smelled of rain and something underneath it, something green and faint and wild, like a garden after a storm. Roses, he thought very quietly. She smells like roses. He turned away before the thought could become anything else. He found Mrs. Gable in the kitchen. She was at the counter, calmly bleaching something that didn't need bleaching at 2 a.m, and she did not turn around when he entered. She looked at him once, a single, efficient sweep from his rolled cuff to his jaw, and whatever she saw settled her expression into the specific brand of disapproval she reserved for things she'd warned him about. "There is a woman on my couch," Silas said. "There is," Mrs. Gable agreed, "and there's blood on your sleeve. Go wash up. You look like a bad decision, and I just cleaned these floors." "The woman. She's sleeping." Mrs. Gable set down the cloth. "She was the gardener next door before the estate sold. I found her in her car in the freezing rain. 3 days, Silas. She'd been out there 3 days. She turned to face him, arms folded, chin level. "I won't apologize." Silence. "She leaves in the morning," he said. I mean it. You also meant it when you swore you'd stop smoking those cigars on the East Terrace." She set a cup of tea on the counter in front of him. "And yet, here we are. Drink that. I swore no one comes inside these walls." Mrs. Gable was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, the sharpness was gone. Just the plain
care voice she used when she was saying something true to someone who needed to hear it. "You swore a lot of things," she said. "After Thomas." A beat. "She's a girl who talked to roses and lost her job and had nowhere to sleep. She's not a threat. She's just a person." She picked up her cup. "Good night, Silas." "Morning," he said. "She leaves." Mrs. Gable nodded, the way she nodded when she decided not to argue with something she had no intention of agreeing with, and disappeared. He told himself he didn't go back. He went back, just to the doorway, just to confirm she hadn't moved, a reasonable precaution, nothing more. He stood there long enough to see the slow rise and fall of her breathing, the blanket still where he'd left it, her hand now curled around the edge of the cushion like she was anchoring herself to something solid in her sleep. He turned off the lamp in the hallway so the light wouldn't reach her. Then he walked away and didn't examine why. The fire had burned to ash by the time she opened her eyes. The room was different in daylight, larger. The curtains held back grey morning light that pressed at their edges like it had been waiting patiently for permission. Iris lay still for a moment, ceiling overhead, warmth around her, and let herself remember. The car, the rain, Mrs. Gable. He's not home until midnight. She sat up. Her duffel bag was by the door, shoes placed neatly beside it, bowl gone from the table. The blanket, the one that had been folded untouched on the arm of the couch, was tucked around her with a carefulness that hadn't been there when she fell asleep. Right, she thought. Right. Okay. Time to go. She reached for her shoes. "You slept 11 hours. The voice came from the armchair. Iris went completely still. He was already there. Had been there, she understood with a cold drop of clarity, for some time. One ankle crossed over his knee. A cup on the table beside him, untouched and long cold. He wasn't reading. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was watching her. The way you watched something you hadn't yet decided what to do with. She had a single, unguarded second to take him in before her composure caught up. And in that second, she understood what Mrs. Gable had meant. He didn't fill the room the way loud men filled rooms. He weighted it. The specific gravity of someone who had never once in his life needed to make himself known.
Her stomach did something it had no business doing. She filed that away immediately and didn't look at it again. Dark hair, a jaw that had been set against something for a long time. The blood was gone from his sleeve. Everything else about him suggested it hadn't gone far. "I'm sorry," Iris said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. "I didn't mean to. Mrs. Gable said—" "I know what Mrs. Gable said." 2 sentences, flat, unhurried, taking up exactly as much space as they needed. She stood, reached for her bag. "I'll get out of your way." "Sit down." Not a request, not a command. The kind of words that assumed compliance so completely that choosing otherwise felt like the unusual option. Iris stood where she was, not sitting, not moving for the door, just holding her ground the small, quiet way she had, the way she'd spent years learning in rooms where she had no leverage. "I appreciate you letting me stay," she said. "I'll be gone in 5 minutes." Something shifted in his expression, a fraction of movement in a very controlled face, the adjustment of a man who had encountered something he hadn't predicted. "You'd go where?" he said. Not cruel, just accurate. The flatness of someone presenting findings. She had nowhere to go. They both knew it. The car, the dead phone, the duffel bag with its limited contents sitting right there between them, like a third party to the conversation. "I'll figure it out," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his cup finally and said, "Sit down, Iris." She blinked at her own name in his mouth. "Mrs. Gable," he said, by way of explanation, not elaborating. She sat, not because he'd told her to, because her legs had made their own decision. Mrs. Gable arrived 4 minutes later with breakfast on a tray and the energy of someone who had absolutely not been listening outside the door. "Good morning," setting the tray down between them with brisk precision. "You look better. Sleep does wonders," to Iris, then a glance at Silas. "You look the same. Eat something." "I've eaten." "You've had coffee. That's not eating, that's enduring." She arranged the tray, toast, eggs, jam, orange juice that looked freshly pressed. "Iris, eat. You've been living on whatever you had in that car, and I'd rather not know the details." Iris looked at the tray, then at Silas, who was watching the exchange, with the expression of a man who had long ago made peace with certain forces being beyond his jurisdiction. "Thank you," Iris said, meaning it, the specific, unhurried way she had of meaning things, each word placed rather than delivered. Mrs. Gable paused. A small, considering look crossed her face, moving between Iris and Silas and back again, quick as a bird deciding where to land. Then she straightened. "I'll get more coffee." She left. The room settled into quiet. Iris picked up a piece of toast. She was aware of him watching her, aware of the distance between armchair and couch, close enough that the low table between them felt less like furniture and more like a technicality. She kept her eyes on the tray. "You were a gardener," he said. "At Thornfield, yes, before it sold." "And before that?" "Different estates, private gardens mostly, some commercial work." She kept her voice even, informational. "I'm good at it." "I know." She looked up. He was looking at her hands. The heat arrived at the back of her neck before she'd identified what caused it, the specific awareness of being seen in a way she hadn't prepared for.
Not glanced at. Seen. The calluses. The soil stain that never quite left the creases of her knuckles no matter how hard she scrubbed. She didn't fold her hands in her lap. She kept them still and kept her chin level and met it. "The gardens here haven't been touched in 2 years," he said.
flat, reportorial, as though he was sharing information rather than offering anything. Mrs. Gable says they're past saving. They're not, Iris said. It came out before she thought about it. Quiet, but certain. The tone that arrived automatically when someone said something untrue about something she knew. He looked at her, not at her hands, at her face. And the look lasted exactly 1 second longer than it should have. 1 beat past casual, past assessing, past anything that could be filed away as neutral. Her breath went first. A shallow, involuntary thing, there and gone before she could manage it. Then her fingers stilled against the toast, not gripping, not releasing, just stopped. Her whole body making a quiet decision her mind was still composing an argument against. He was still looking. She could feel it, the way you felt a fire from across a room. Not burning, not yet, just present, certain, patient. She looked back at her toast. He said nothing. That was somehow worse. Nothing's past saving, she said more quietly. Usually they just need someone to pay attention. The silence that followed sat differently than the ones before it, as though something had been said that was larger than what was said. She didn't look up to check his expression. She didn't trust herself to. She didn't notice the man in the doorway until the coffee arrived. Mrs. Gable had reappeared with the pot, was pouring without being asked, was beginning something about the East Garden. It had roses once, beautiful ones, before, when Iris registered the shape in her peripheral vision. Not Mrs. Gable, not staff. A man, standing just outside the sitting room door,
hard-edged in the particular way of men who were paid to be. His eyes moved over the room, over Mrs. Gable, over the breakfast tray, over Iris, with the flat efficiency of someone cataloguing, not observing, not curious, assessing. Iris felt it like a temperature drop. She looked at Silas. He hadn't turned his head, hadn't shifted in his chair. But something had changed in him. A quality of attention that had been resting and was now, very quietly, not. He lifted his eyes from his cup, looked at a point somewhere just past Iris's left shoulder. One look. The man in the doorway was gone. No sound, no footsteps. Just gone, as though he'd never been there. Silas's eyes returned to his cup. The quality of attention settled back. He picked up where Mrs. Gable had left off as though nothing had happened. "The East Garden," Mrs. Gable was saying, with the serenity of someone who had learned not to register certain things, "had the most extraordinary roses. Your mother's favorites, if I remember." Gable. "I'm just making conversation." She handed Iris a cup. "Your room is the third on the left upstairs. Fresh towels are out." Iris opened her mouth. "She's not staying," Silas said. "Where's she going?" "That's not because I asked, and she doesn't know yet." Mrs. Gable looked at Iris with the patient reasonableness of a woman holding all the cards and choosing not to play them all at once. "Do you, love?" Iris looked at Silas. He was watching her. That same quality of attention, contained, deliberate, giving nothing away except the fact of its presence. He's waiting, she realized. He actually wants to hear the answer. "I don't know yet," she said. Honest, because she didn't know how to be otherwise. Something moved in his jaw. The specific micro-adjustment of a decision being made in real time, of a wall being assessed, and the conclusion arriving. Not today. "The room," he said, "is temporary." Mrs. Gable's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Brief, bright, satisfied. And she was gone before he could revise the terms. Iris looked at her hands around the coffee cup, at the table between them, at the doorway where the man had been standing and was no longer. She thought about the two men at the gate last night, the locked corridor, the way Mrs. Gable navigated the house like someone who knew which rooms were safe and which were not. She thought about the word temporary and the way he'd said it, like a door he was holding open while deciding whether to close it. She didn't look at him, but she was aware, with every nerve she had, that he hadn't looked away. Across the room, Silas set down his cup, looked at the doorway Mrs. Gable had disappeared through, then at Iris. "Temporary," he said, quietly, to no one in particular. He didn't sound like he believed it. She was up before dawn. Old habit. The kind that lived in the body rather than the mind. The particular alarm clock of someone who had spent years working with growing things, who knew that the best hour in any garden was the one before the world remembered it existed. She didn't plan to go outside. She just ended up there. The back door off the kitchen was unlocked. Mrs. Gable's doing, she suspected. Or possibly the house itself. The old stone manor feeling less like a building and more like something that made quiet decisions about who it let through its doors and where it let them wander. The air was sharp, still carrying last night's rain. The sky was the specific grey-blue of very early morning that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be beautiful or brutal. Then she saw the garden, or what was left of it. It was vast, far larger than she'd expected, stretching the full length of the eastern wing, bounded by a low stone wall that had once been maintained and now had moss growing deep in its joints. Iron archways, 3 of them, still standing but stripped bare. Paths of pale gravel barely visible under 2 years of unchecked growth. And the roses. Oh, they were still there. All of them. Overgrown, unpruned, growing wild and sideways in every direction. But alive. Stubbornly, defiantly alive. Sending up new canes through the wreckage of the old ones, reaching toward the grey sky with the specific determination of things that had decided not to die, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. Iris stood at the edge of the path for a long moment. Then she crouched down and pressed her fingers into the soil. Cold, dense, compacted from neglect. But underneath there was something. A give. A warmth that lived deeper than the surface. The particular quality of ground that remembered being tended and was waiting, patiently, to be tended again. Not past saving, she thought. Not even close. She didn't have tools. She didn't have permission. She pulled a weed anyway. The long, satisfying resistance of deep roots giving way. And then another. And then she stopped counting. She felt him before she heard him. That was the thing she wouldn't be able to explain afterward. The way her body registered him before her eyes did. A prickle at the base of her neck. A sudden sharp awareness of the air changing behind her. The particular shift of atmosphere that happened when something large and very still entered a space that had been empty. Her hands stilled in the soil. Every instinct she had went quiet, in the specific way instincts went quiet when they were paying attention to something they hadn't categorized yet. She turned. Silas was standing at the edge of the garden path. He hadn't dressed for outside. Dark trousers, a shirt with the collar open, no jacket despite the cold. He stood the way he stood everywhere, she was beginning to understand. Like the stillness wasn't something he performed, but something he simply was. Like the space around him had reorganized itself to accommodate the fact of him.
He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hands. She became aware, in a single unwelcome rush, of exactly how she must appear. Kneeling in the wet soil at 5 a.m, hair loose, cheeks cold pink, knuckles dark with earth. Every polished, composed version of herself she might have preferred to present was somewhere back in the warm house, and what was here instead was just her. Unguarded. caught in the act of caring about something. Of course it's him, she thought. Of course. Her pulse had done something it had no business doing. She sat back on her heels, kept her voice even. I know. I should have asked. Yes. I'll stop. I didn't say that. He looked at the roses then, at the long, arching canes she'd begun to untangle from each other, at the new growth she'd cleared around, at the shape the bed was beginning to remember. Something moved through his expression that she didn't have a name for yet. Something that lived underneath the controlled flatness, in a place the control had been specifically built to cover. Mrs. Gable said they were your mother's, Iris said. Quietly, not pushing. Just placing it there in the space between them, in case he wanted it. His jaw tightened. 1 second. 2. She planted them the year I was born, he said. She said a garden needed something that came back every year. Something you could count on. Flat, factual. But underneath the flatness, weight. The specific weight of something carried a long time without being set down. Iris looked back at the roses. They're coming back, she said, simply, as though it were just information. She felt him go still in a way that was different from his usual stillness, not controlled, just stopped. The way a person stopped when they'd been handed something small and true and didn't know yet whether they were allowed to keep it. She found the old tool shed herself, tucked against the east wall behind an overgrown boxwood, padlocked, but the padlock rusted through. Inside, a trowel, pruning shears, a kneeling pad that had seen better decades. All of it where someone had left it. All of it waiting. She brought both trowels back to the path. Silas was still there. She hadn't expected that. He'd moved, not closer exactly, but differently. Less like a man maintaining distance, and more like a man who had quietly stopped calculating the distance. He was leaning against the stone wall, arms crossed, watching her with the expression she was beginning to read as the closest he came to unguarded. She held out the second trowel. He looked at it, then at her. I'm not going to. I know, she said. You can just hold it. He took it, and in the single second of transfer, her fingers releasing, his closing around the handle, she saw his hand properly for the first time. The size of it, the specific, quiet authority of it. A hand that had signed things and broken things and built things, that had spent decades in a world she was only beginning to understand the edges of. The trowel looked almost absurd in it, small and domestic and completely out of place. She looked up and found him already watching her. The heat arrived at her throat before she'd named what caused it. She turned back to the soil. Don't, she told herself. Her hands had already decided they weren't listening. They worked. She worked, he leaned, for the better part of an hour. The sky made its decision and went beautiful, pale gold breaking through the gray in long, unhurried bands. The roses emerged from their neglect in increments, each cleared cane revealing the shape the bed had been, what it was remembering how to be. He spoke once, without looking at her. You do talk to them. Iris's hands stilled. Heat moved up the back of her neck. Mrs. Gable told you. Mrs. Gable tells me everything she thinks I need to know. A pause. I came out at 5 this morning. I heard you from the doorway. She kept her eyes on the soil. It helps them. There's research, sound vibrations, carbon dioxide. She pulled a stubborn weed. Or maybe they just like knowing someone's paying attention. I'm not sure it matters which. My father taught me that. He said the most important things in the world are usually the ones nobody else is looking at. Silence. Then quietly, so quietly she almost lost it under the sound of wind through the canes. "No," he said. "I don't suppose it does." She didn't look up. She understood, without either of them naming it, that he wasn't talking about the roses. His phone rang at 8:30. He stepped away from the wall, 10 feet, maybe 12, and answered it with his back half turned toward her. She heard the shift in him before she processed it consciously. The quality of his voice dropping into something lower, flatter, more deliberate. The register of a man who had walked into a different room inside himself, locked the door, pulled the blinds, become someone else entirely while standing in the same garden. She kept working. She wasn't trying to listen. The garden was quiet enough that she didn't need to. A name she didn't recognize, a location, something about a timeline that had moved. Then the listening pause, long, very still, of a man absorbing information he wasn't surprised by, but wasn't pleased about either. Then he spoke again, 4 words, low and final, and in a language she didn't speak, but absolutely didn't need to. The tone was its own translation. A door being closed, a consequence being issued to someone who had exhausted the grace period for avoiding it. That was what he sounded like, she understood, when the controlled flatness became something else, when the weight underneath it stopped being weight and became something with edges. She pressed her trowel into the soil. She did not look up. He hung up. 10 seconds of silence. Then he walked back to the wall, unhurried even,
like the call had been about nothing in particular, and leaned against the stone beside her like nothing had changed. Everything has changed, she thought. She had heard men speak like that before, the particular register of it, the weight that lived underneath ordinary words when the person sang them, had the kind of authority that didn't require volume. She had worked for those men, had learned to read the temperature of a room when they entered it, to make herself invisible in the specific way that people who worked for powerful people learned to be invisible. She had never stayed in the room after. She kept her hands in the soil. She kept working. He came back to the wall. She didn't examine what it meant that she'd noticed, that she'd been counting the seconds without realizing it, that the part of her which had always known when to leave had gone very quiet and was showing no signs of waking up. Mrs. Gable appeared at 9 with coffee and the expression of a woman who had looked out the kitchen window and seen exactly what she'd been hoping to see. She set the tray on the stone wall, poured 2 cups without being asked, looked at the cleared beds and the untangled canes, and made a sound in the back of her throat that sat somewhere between satisfaction and grief. "Your mother would have liked you," she said to Iris. Silas went very still. The particular stillness, not the controlled kind. The kind that happened when something landed somewhere it wasn't defended against. Mrs. Gable picked up her tray with the serenity of someone who had said the true thing and was now leaving it to do its work. She looked at Silas once, the look of a woman who had known him long enough to say everything without a word, and went back inside. The garden was quiet. Iris reached for her coffee. Her fingers were cold from the soil. She wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the warmth move through her palms, and looked at the pale gold moving slow across the roses, and did not look at him. She was aware of him beside her at the wall. The distance between them, a foot, maybe slightly less, felt different than it had an hour ago. The phone call sat between them like a third presence, unnamed and unaddressed. The 4 words, the locked door quality of his voice, the version of him she'd heard, and the version of him standing here with garden dirt on his sleeve from where he'd leaned too close to an untangled cane. Both of them the same man. She held her coffee and didn't look at him, and thought about that. She felt his hand move before she saw it. Not toward her, not exactly,
just a shift. A small, deliberate adjustment of his hand on top of the stone wall. Fingers settling, closing half the distance between his hand and hers without completing it. Not touching, not retreating, just present. An inch away. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the side of her hand without any contact at all. Her breath caught. She didn't move her hand away. Neither did he. She became aware of him the way you became aware of a fire, not by looking at it, but by what it did to the air around it. The warmth of his hand an inch from hers. The specific stillness of him at her side. Not the stillness of someone waiting, but the stillness of someone who had made a decision and was sitting inside it. She could feel his presence along her entire left side, her arm, her shoulder, the side of her neck. Don't, she thought. Her pulse didn't listen. It kicked, hard, low, deliberate. The kind of response that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the inch of air between his hand and hers, and the fact that neither of them was closing it, and neither of them was walking away. She stared at the roses. She could not have named a single one. His hand didn't move. Neither did hers. The silence between them had weight now. The specific gravity of something being held back by will alone, on both sides, and both of them knowing it. The garden held its breath. The pale gold light moved across the stone. Somewhere inside the house, a clock ticked through 10 seconds that felt like so much more than 10 seconds. Then Mrs. Gable dropped something in the kitchen. The spell released, not breaking, just exhaling. Like a breath that had been held too long finally finding its way out. Iris picked up her coffee with hands that were not entirely steady. Silas pushed off the wall. "The shears need sharpening," he said. His voice was back, even, controlled, giving nothing away. "I'll have someone see to it." He walked back toward the house without waiting for a response. Iris looked at the space where his hand had been. The stone was still warm. She stood there a moment longer, coffee in both hands, roses around her, the morning light unhurried across everything, and let herself feel the full, complicated weight of what had just settled over her. The man who had said, "I don't suppose it does," about roses and someone paying attention. The man whose voice had become something with edges when he'd said 4 words into a phone in a language she didn't speak. The man whose hand had been an inch from hers for 60 seconds and hadn't moved. All of them the same man. All of them walking away across the grass in the pale morning gold. She turned back to the garden. She had more weeds to pull, and underneath all of it, underneath the roses and the warmth and the not entirely steady hands, a quieter thought, small and persistent, the way the most important thoughts always were. He took that call, she thought, and then he came back to the wall. He didn't have to do that. He came back anyway. 4 days. That was how long it took Iris to understand the rhythm of Ashworth Manor. Not the schedule of it. She'd figured that out quickly enough. Mrs. Gable's domain ran on a precise internal clock. Breakfast at 8, the east corridor off limits until noon, dinner at 7, whether Silas appeared for it or not. The house had its routines and its rules and its locked doors, and Iris had learned which ones applied to her and which ones she was simply meant to pretend she hadn't noticed. It was the other rhythm she'd needed time to understand, the human one. Silas left before she woke most mornings. She'd hear the car, low and deliberate, crunching over the gravel drive sometime before 6. He returned at unpredictable hours, sometimes before dinner, sometimes long after it. Sometimes she heard him in the hallway outside her door at 2 in the morning, Footsteps measured and quiet, pausing briefly, moving on. And she would lie still in the dark and stare at the ceiling and not examine what it meant, that she'd learned the particular sound of his walk well enough to know it was him without looking. She was in the garden every morning. He found her there every time, not immediately, not obviously. He would appear at some point between 7 and 9, no jacket, regardless of the cold, coffee that cooled untouched on the wall beside her, and they would work in the specific silence they'd built together over 4 days. A silence that had its own vocabulary now, its own weight and texture and meaning. The roses were coming back faster than she'd expected. She wasn't sure what to do with the parallel. She heard the car at 10:30 on the 5th day. Not Silas's car. She knew the sound of that now, low and unhurried, a car that moved like its driver. This was different. A heavier engine, moving faster up the drive than anyone with legitimate business moved. She sat back on her heels and listened. Mrs. Gable appeared at the back door 30 seconds later, unhurried, wiping her hands on a cloth.
Her expression carrying the specific neutrality she wore when something was happening that she'd decided Iris didn't need to be alarmed by.
"Come inside for a bit, love."
It wasn't a suggestion. Iris looked at the drive. The car had stopped at the front of the house. She could hear a door, voices, the particular silence that fell when people were being careful about what they said outdoors.
"Who is it?" she asked. "Someone with an appointment." Mrs. Gable held the back door open. "Come inside." She came inside. She didn't go far. The kitchen looked out over the side garden, not the front drive, but close enough that through the window she could see the edge of the entrance, the corner of a dark car, the movement of men. She stood at the counter with her coffee and watched what she could see and listened to what she couldn't, and told herself she wasn't doing either. She heard Silas's voice before she saw him, low and even, carrying across the courtyard without effort. The tone he used when he was being polite to someone he wasn't pleased to see. Then she saw him, coming around the corner of the house with a man she didn't recognize. The stranger was well-dressed, expensive coat, the kind of haircut that cost more than most people's groceries. He moved with the ease of someone accustomed to walking into rooms that belonged to other people and behaving as though they belonged to him instead. He was talking, something Silas was listening to without responding to, in the way he listened to things he'd already decided about. Then the stranger looked up, directly at the kitchen window, directly at her. Iris didn't step back. She held her coffee and met his gaze and kept her face neutral in the way she'd learned to keep it neutral, the way you learned, in years of working for wealthy people, to make yourself into furniture. The stranger smiled. It was the kind of smile that arrived before the eyes did. She watched Silas register it.
He hadn't been looking at her. He'd been looking at the stranger. But something shifted in his peripheral attention, a small, almost imperceptible reorientation. And then he looked. At the window. At her. At the stranger. Back at the stranger. Whatever had been in his face a moment before was gone. What replaced it was something she hadn't seen from him before. Not the controlled flatness of their mornings together, not the weighted quiet of the garden. Something older than both of those. Flatter, more absolute. The kind of expression that didn't need to announce itself. The stranger's smile stayed where it was, but something behind it adjusted, recalculated. He said something to Silas. Silas replied without moving his eyes from the man's face. One sentence. Quiet. Final. The stranger looked at the window one more time. Then he looked away. The meeting, whatever it was, lasted 40 minutes. Iris stayed in the kitchen. Mrs. Gable made lunch and didn't explain anything, and periodically refreshed Iris's coffee in the manner of a woman who communicated entirely through practical acts of care. "He's not a nice man," Iris said at some point. "Most of them aren't,"
Mrs. Gable said, placidly, as though this were a fact about weather. Does he come here often? Twice before. Today is the third time. She set a plate of toast on the counter with the precision of someone punctuating a sentence. The first 2 times, Silas saw him at the gate, didn't let him past it. A pause, brief, deliberate. He let him past it today. Iris looked at her. Mrs. Gable's expression gave nothing away, but her eyes did. The particular quality of eyes that were telling you something important and waiting to see if you were paying enough attention to receive it. He let him past the gate today, Iris thought. Because of me. Because someone told him I was here, and he needed to see for himself. The coffee was warm in her hands. It tasted like nothing at all. Silas found her in the garden afterward. He came around the corner of the east wing and stopped at the edge of the path, the same spot he always stopped, the same way he always arrived. But something was different in him today. The controlled stillness was present, but it was doing more work than usual, covering more ground. Iris kept her hands in the soil. She waited. You should have gone upstairs, he said. Mrs. Gable said to come inside. I came inside. I meant further inside. I know what you meant. She pulled a weed, set it aside. Who was he? Silence. Someone with business here. That's not an answer. He looked at her then, a quick, sharp look, the kind that happened when something surprised him. Not what she'd said, the fact that she'd said it, the flat, unimpressed quality of it, the way she'd delivered it like someone returning a letter marked wrong address. No, he said after a moment. It isn't. She looked up. He was looking at her the way he sometimes looked at the roses, like he was assessing what was actually there rather than what he'd expected to find. Like he kept arriving at a different answer than the one he'd prepared for. His name is Wren, Silas said, quietly, like the name cost something. He moves between organizations, sells information to whoever pays for it. A pause. He saw you the night you arrived. The cold arrived before the understanding did. She thought about the entrance hall, the careful route Mrs. Gable had taken, the door at the far end of the corridor, the 2 men standing outside it, the meeting that had been happening while she'd been eating soup and falling asleep in front of the fire. He was here that night, she said. Yes. And he wanted to know who I was. Yes. She set the trowel down. She looked at the cleared earth around her. 4 days of work, the roses emerging from their neglect in long, patient increments, and she let the information settle into her the way soil settled after rain, slowly, finding its level. Am I in danger? She asked. The word sat there between them, plain and unadorned. She hadn't softened it or qualified it. She'd simply placed it there and waited. Because she was someone who preferred to look at true things directly, rather than approach them sideways. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Not while you're here, he said. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a statement of intent. The specific weight of a man saying something he intended to make true, regardless of what it cost. She heard the difference. She picked up the trowel. Then I'll stay in the garden, she said. He didn't leave. She hadn't expected him to. Not really. Not anymore. He settled against the wall in the way she'd come to recognize as his particular version of staying. Not helping. Not hovering. Just present. Keeping her company in the specific way that didn't announce itself as keeping her company. She worked. He watched. At some point, she became aware that he'd moved, not significantly, not dramatically, just slightly closer than he'd been. An unconscious adjustment, maybe. Or not unconscious at all. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. The roses were coming in gold-tipped now, the new growth catching the afternoon light. She worked her way along the bed, and he tracked her progress from the wall, and the particular silence between them had that weight again. The weight it had acquired at the wall 3 mornings ago, and hadn't fully set down since. Then he said quietly, "You didn't ask me to take you somewhere safer." She sat back on her heels, considered the rose cane in her hands, a long, arching thing, working its way back toward the iron archway where it was supposed to climb. She guided it toward the frame and wound it gently, and didn't look at him. "Would you have?" she asked. A beat. "No." She looked at him then. He was already looking at her, that direct,
Undeflected attention that still caught her off guard because there was nothing performative in it. He wasn't looking to see her reaction. He was just looking. The way he'd looked at the roses and said they were your mother's and waited to see if she was handing him something real. She held his gaze. "Then it wasn't a real option," she said simply. "So there was no point in asking for it." Something moved through his expression, deep and brief, and gone before she could read it fully. His jaw shifted, that particular micro-adjustment she'd catalogued as the movement of a decision being made. He looked away first. First time. She filed that away, too, and turned back to the roses, and didn't let herself examine what it meant that her heart was beating the way it was beating, steady and too fast, and completely, utterly awake. That night she couldn't sleep. Not unusual, the past 4 days. The house had its sounds, the particular settling of old stone in cold hours, the distant movement of men on the perimeter she'd stopped pretending she couldn't hear. She'd learned to sleep through most of it. Tonight, she lay still and looked at the ceiling and thought about Wren. His smile. The way it had arrived before his eyes. The way Silas's face had changed when he'd seen where Wren was looking. "Not while you're here." She turned it over carefully, the way she turned difficult soil, patiently, looking for what was underneath. He'd set it like a guarantee, like a wall he was placing between her and whatever Wren represented. She thought about the phone call in the garden, the 4 words, the locked door quality of his voice. She thought about the man she'd been slowly assembling across 5 days, from the blanket pulled up in the dark, to the trowel accepted without explanation, to, "I don't suppose it does," said so quietly about roses and attention. She laid him alongside the man who'd said 4 words into a phone, like a consequence, and the man whose face had gone absolutely flat when a stranger smiled at her kitchen window. Same man. All of it the same man. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she got up, pulled on the oversized sweater Mrs. Gable had left on her chair, his favorite, she'd said, too casually, in the way she said things she intended to land, and went down to the kitchen. Mrs. Gable was already there. Of course she was. Sitting at the kitchen table with tea and a crossword, and the expression of a woman who had been expecting company and had simply waited for it to arrive. She didn't say anything. She got up, put the kettle on, came back to the table, and set a second cup down across from her own. Iris sat. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The kettle built toward boiling. The clock on the wall counted out the quiet. Outside, the grounds were dark and still, and somewhere out there were men whose job it was to keep them that way. "He's going to handle it," Mrs. Gable said. Not a question. "I know," Iris said. "Are you frightened?" Iris considered this honestly, the way she considered everything, without reaching for the comfortable answer. "I think I should be," she said. "More than I am." Mrs. Gable made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been something else entirely. She poured the tea,
set the cup in front of Iris with the careful placement of someone who understood that small warmths mattered most when everything else was uncertain. "He cleared the house the night you arrived," she said. "Sent all his men to the perimeter. He wanted to be alone." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "He hasn't cleared the house since you got here." Iris looked at her tea. She thought about the footsteps in the hallway at 2 a.m, pausing, moving on. She thought about the stone still warm where his hand had been. "Mrs. Gable," she said slowly. He's going to be angry that you told me that." Mrs. Gable picked up her crossword. "He's always angry about something," she said serenely. "It keeps him occupied." She was still at the kitchen table when she heard the front door. 1:43 a.m. She knew because she'd looked at the clock 30 seconds before, an unconscious cataloging of the time, the kind her body had started doing on its own. Footsteps in the entrance hall, the particular weight and rhythm of them, then stopping. She knew he'd seen the kitchen light. She knew he was standing in the hallway right now, processing the fact of it, deciding something. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the steam rising from it and waited. The kitchen door opened. Silas stood in the doorway. He'd been somewhere that had required the jacket, the dark one, the one that fit the way expensive things fit, like it had been made for the specific architecture of him. His collar was open. He looked like a man who had spent several hours resolving something difficult and had come home to find his kitchen occupied and didn't know yet how he felt about that. His eyes moved to Mrs. Gable's second cup, then to Iris. She met his gaze across the kitchen. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then, quietly, the first time he'd ever sounded like something other than controlled. "You're still here," he said. She looked at him, at the tiredness he wasn't quite hiding, at the jacket and the open collar, and the particular quality of a man who had spent the evening being whatever the world needed him to be, and had walked through his own front door still carrying the weight of it. She thought about "not while you're here," and the stone warm under her palm, and the footsteps pausing outside her door. "The roses aren't finished," she said. Something happened in his face. Not much, not dramatically, just a fractional softening. The specific movement of a wall deciding very quietly not to hold quite as hard as it had been holding. He looked at her for one long moment. Then he crossed to the counter, poured himself a glass of water, and leaned against it. Not leaving, not sitting, just staying. In the way he stayed in the garden. The way that didn't announce itself. Mrs. Gable, without looking up from her crossword, smiled the small, precise smile of a woman whose plans were proceeding exactly as intended. She found it at 5:47 a.m. She knew the time because she'd been awake since 5, the particular restlessness of a mind that had processed everything it safely could and was now circling the edges of what it hadn't. She'd been lying in the dark listening to the house breathe and thinking about Wren's smile and the photograph she hadn't taken and the way Silas had said, "Not while you're here," like he was nailing something shut. The envelope was on the floor just inside her door. White, unmarked, slipped through the gap at the bottom with the specific care of someone who didn't want to make noise. She looked at it for a long moment from the bed. Then she got up. It was a single photograph. Her, in the garden, kneeling in the soil, with her hands in the earth, and her face turned slightly toward the roses, unaware. Taken through a gap in the stone wall from outside the perimeter, she could see the edge of the moss, the angle of the shot, the particular quality of light that placed it 2 mornings ago, maybe 3. Close enough to see her face clearly, close enough to count the mud on her knuckles. She stood in the middle of her room in the gray pre-dawn and looked at it for a long time. Felt the cold of the floorboards through her socks, heard the clock on the mantel count out the seconds. "We can reach you," the photograph said. In the language of photographs like this, in the vocabulary of men like Wren, "We can reach you whenever we choose. He told you that you were safe. Look at how safe you are." She set it on the bed. She pulled on her clothes.
She went to find Silas. His study was at the end of the east corridor, the corridor she'd been steered away from on the first night, the one with the locked door and the two men outside it, who didn't look like staff. She walked it now with the photograph in her hand and noted, distantly, that the men were gone. The perimeter shift, probably, the rotation that happened before dawn, and that the door at the end was showing a line of light underneath it. She knocked once. A pause. "Come in." She opened the door. He was at the desk, jacketless, sleeves rolled, the kind of deep into the morning work that suggested he hadn't been to bed. The desk itself was, she catalogued it quickly, automatically, the way she'd learned to catalog things in this house, orderly but dense. Ledgers, a laptop with 3 separate windows open, the burner phone beside it, and another phone beside that. A glass of something amber that hadn't been touched. He looked up when she entered. His eyes moved to her face, then to the photograph in her hand. He went very still. She crossed the room and set it on the desk in front of him, flat, face up. She didn't say anything. She just waited. He looked at the photograph for a long time. She watched his face while he did, because she'd decided, sometime between finding the envelope and knocking on his door, that she was going to look at true things directly, that she was going to watch his face when he saw what she was holding, and let whatever she found there be information. What she found was not what she'd expected. Not anger, or not only anger. Not the flat, absolute quality he'd turned on Wren in the courtyard. Something underneath that. Underneath the controlled surface of him, in the place the control was specifically built to protect. He looked, very briefly, like a man who had failed at something that mattered. It was gone in a second. The walls came back up in that fast, practiced way they did, smooth and automatic and nearly invisible. But she'd seen it. She filed it away beside everything else she'd collected. "When did you find this?" he said, quiet, precise. 5 minutes ago, under the door." He looked at the photograph again, at the angle of the shot, at the gap in the wall it had been taken through. She watched him trace the geometry of it, the breach, the failure of the perimeter, the specific point where something had come through that shouldn't have. "Go to the kitchen," he said. "Stay with Mrs. Gable." "Silas." "Iris," he looked up, his eyes on her face, direct and very serious, and carrying something she didn't have a name for yet. "Please." The please was what moved her. She went. Mrs. Gable was already in the kitchen. Of course she was. Iris was beginning to suspect Mrs. Gable existed in a state of permanent, serene preparedness for exactly the kind of morning this was turning into. Kettle on, table clear, 2 cups out before Iris had sat down. She sat. She put the photograph face down on the table without explanation. Mrs. Gable looked at the back of it, then at Iris. Then she poured the tea and sat across from her and picked up yesterday's crossword and didn't ask a single question. They sat together in the warm kitchen and listened to the house. At some point, 20 minutes in, maybe 30, they heard the front door. Silas's footsteps, going out, not in, measured and deliberate and very, very quiet. Mrs. Gable filled in 7 across. Iris wrapped both hands around her cup. They waited. He was gone for 2 hours. She didn't ask where he'd gone.
She didn't ask what he was doing or who he was doing it to, or what the resolution of a breach like this looked like in the world he operated in. She sat in the kitchen and drank 3 cups of tea and helped Mrs. Gable shell a bowl of peas, because Mrs. Gable had produced them from somewhere, and the rhythm of it, the small, repetitive
domestic task, was the only thing that kept her hands from doing what they wanted to do, which was shake. She wasn't frightened for herself anymore. She understood that was a significant shift. She catalogued it carefully, turned it over, looked at what was underneath it. She was frightened for him. That was new. That was its own kind of information. He came back through the kitchen door at 8:14 a.m. She knew it was him before the door opened, the weight of the footsteps, the particular rhythm. She'd catalogued it so thoroughly, it had become as automatic as breathing. He came through the door and stopped. He hadn't expected her to still be there, she could see that. The fractional adjustment of a man who had prepared himself for an empty room and found it occupied. His eyes moved to her face, then to Mrs. Gable, then back to her. She looked at him properly. The jacket was gone, left somewhere or never taken. His shirt was— her eyes moved across it with the quick efficiency of someone assessing damage— intact, mostly. But his right hand, hanging at his side, was not. The knuckles, split and dark. The kind of damage that happened when something hard met something harder, or when the thing you were hitting declined to stay down on the first attempt. There was a cut at the corner of his mouth, small, already clotting, but there. She was on her feet before she'd decided to stand up. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her. "Sit down, Silas." Something moved through his expression, the specific flicker of a man encountering a tone he hadn't heard from her before. Not asking, not soft-edged, just clear, certain. The same voice she used in the garden when she said, "They're not past saving," and meant it like a fact. He sat down. Mrs. Gable had the first aid kit on the counter before Iris had crossed the kitchen, produced from the cabinet under the sink with the efficiency of a woman who had done this before more than once and had long ago stopped commenting on the necessity of it. She set it on the table beside Silas and left the room. Just like that. No explanation, no dramatic exit, just gone, with the tact of someone who understood when a room needed fewer people in it. Iris pulled her chair around to his side of the table. She sat. She opened the kit, found the antiseptic, the gauze, the things she needed. She arranged them on the table with the same care she gave to tools in the garden. Everything in reach, everything placed where it was supposed to be. Then she reached for his hand. He let her take it. That was the thing she'd remember afterward. Not the cut or the damage or the specific evidence of whatever the last 2 hours had contained. The fact that he let her take his hand and held it still in both of hers and didn't flinch away or deflect or put the walls back up. He just let her. She cleaned the knuckles with careful, deliberate strokes. She felt him watching her while she worked, but she kept her eyes on her hands, on the task, on the specific, grounding reality of tending to something that needed tending. She'd spent years learning how to be useful without being intrusive, how to give care without making the recipient feel observed. She worked in silence for a while. Then she said, quietly, not looking up, "Thomas." Just the name, placed there the way she placed everything, carefully, without force in case he wanted it. The hand in hers went very still. She kept working, didn't push, didn't look up. The clock on the wall counted out the seconds. "He was my brother," Silas said. Low, flat. The way he said difficult things, stripped of everything except the essential truth of them.
I know, she said gently. Mrs. Gable told you. Mrs. Gable told me his name. I figured out the rest. She set aside the gauze, reached for the cut at the corner of his mouth, her fingers light on his jaw, turning his face toward the kitchen light. Hold still. He held still.
She worked on the cut with the careful attention she gave to damaged things.
She could feel his jaw under her fingers, the tension in it, the specific, long-held tension of a man who had been clenching something shut for years and was sitting very still to avoid the cost of letting it open. He died 8 years ago, Silas said. To the middle distance, to the kitchen table, to the particular quality of attention she gave things without demanding anything back from them. It wasn't an accident. It was dressed up as one. Car accident, bad weather, wrong place. But it wasn't. A beat. It was meant for me. He was in my car because I'd asked him to be. Because I needed him somewhere and I didn't think... He stopped. She didn't fill the silence. She moved the gauze in careful strokes and let the silence be what it was, and waited. I swore after that, he said, that nothing would get that close again. No one inside the walls. No one who could be used against me. His eyes moved, not to her face, not yet, to her hands, still working on his. That was the theory. She looked up then. He was already looking at her. The distance between them was not the inch of the garden wall, not the careful, measured distance he'd maintained across every room and every silence since she'd woken up in his sitting room 6 days ago. It was less than that. The kitchen table was small, and she'd pulled her chair to his side, and she'd been holding his face in her hands for the last 3 minutes, and somewhere in the geography of all of that, the distance had simply gone, like it had never been the point. The theory had a flaw, she said. Yes, he said. It did. His hand came up, slowly, deliberately. The damaged one, the split knuckles she'd just finished wrapping, and it covered hers where it rested against his jaw. Not moving her hand away, not pressing it closer, just covering it. His hand over hers.
Warm and certain and careful in the way large things were careful when they understood what they were capable of. Iris. Her name. Just her name. But the way he said it this time was completely different from every other time. The warning gone out of it. The controlled flatness gone. Something underneath both of those things finally allowed to surface. She looked at him. She looked at the cut at his lip, and the tiredness he'd stopped hiding, and the walls he'd spent 8 years building sitting somewhere behind his eyes, still present, but quiet now, not holding, not resisting, just there, like something that had agreed to rest. She kissed him, or he kissed her. Afterwards, she genuinely wouldn't be able to say which, only that it happened the way inevitable things happened. Not dramatically, not desperately, but with the specific, settled weight of something that had been decided long before either of them made the decision. Like the roses coming back. Patient, certain. Against all reasonable expectation, returning. It was gentle. That was the thing that undid her completely. That this man, who said 4 words into phones like consequences, and went out in the early morning to resolve things that came back with split knuckles, kissed her like she was something he was afraid of breaking. Like she was the fragile one. Like the careful thing in the room was her. She kissed him back and felt his hand move from hers to the side of her face, warm and certain and very, very still. And the kitchen was quiet around them, and outside the grounds were pale with early morning light, and somewhere in the east garden the roses were catching the first of the sun. It ended. Not dramatically, Just the way held breaths ended, with a slow, necessary release. He rested his forehead against hers for a moment, eyes closed, the tiredness fully visible now, not hidden, not managed, just present. In the way he was letting things be present this morning that he'd kept behind glass for 8 years. She didn't move away, neither did he. "Wren," she said quietly, against the stillness. "Is it handled?" "The man who let the photograph through is gone." A pause. "Wren will understand the message." "And his employer?" He lifted his head, looked at her. Something in his eyes that was complicated and honest, and not trying to be either less or more than what it was. "That," he said, "is going to take longer." She nodded. She'd expected that. She wasn't sure when she'd started expecting the honest answer instead of the managed one. Somewhere around the 3rd morning in the garden, probably. Somewhere around, "I don't suppose it does." "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay." "I'm not leaving," she said, simply. Not bravely. She wasn't performing anything. Just stating what was true the way she stated true things. In case that wasn't clear. Something moved through his face, deep and brief, and this time she caught it fully. The specific, fractional softening of a man who had been braced for a different answer for so long that the right one arrived like something he didn't know how to hold yet. He'd learn. She'd give him time. "Mrs. Gable is going to be insufferable about this," he said. Iris looked at the kitchen door, at the very obvious absence of Mrs. Gable, who had removed herself with extraordinary timing and was certainly not on the other side of it. "She already is," Iris said. From somewhere just beyond the door came the distinct sound of a crossword being picked up with great serenity. Silas looked at the ceiling. Iris picked up her tea. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway, both hands around the cup, shoulders settling, the particular quality of a body that had been holding something tightly for days, finally, carefully, beginning to let it go. Outside, the sun was properly up now. The roses were catching it. The new growth, the cleared canes, the long, patient work of something coming back to life, in increments so small, you could only see them if you'd been paying attention from the beginning. She had been paying attention from the beginning. That, she understood now, was always going to be the thing that got her into trouble. Not recklessness, not bravery, just the specific, inherited, impossible-to-cure habit of noticing the things that were still alive in the wreckage and deciding, quietly, that they were worth staying for. Her father had warned her about that. He had said it like it was a flaw. She was beginning to think he'd been wrong. 6 months later, the roses were rioting. That was the only word for it, not blooming, rioting, cascading over the iron archways in heavy, fragrant curtains of red and white and the particular deep blush that sat somewhere between both. Climbing the stone wall and spilling over the top of it, sending long, triumphant canes across the gravel paths as though they'd been planning this for the 2 years they'd spent waiting for someone to notice them, and had decided, now that someone had, to make the most of it comprehensively. Iris stood at the edge of the path on a Tuesday morning in July and looked at what the garden had become and felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of someone who had always known this was possible and had simply needed to stay long enough to see it. The air smelled extraordinary. Behind her, boots on the gravel. "Marco says the east archway is pulling away from the wall." She didn't turn around. "I know. I asked him to loosen it last week. The cane needed room to grow." A pause. The particular pause of a man recalibrating. "You asked Marco to damage my infrastructure."
I asked Marco to give the roses space. She tilted her head, considering the archway in question. He understood immediately.
He's very good with context. She heard something that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite a sound of amusement, but lived in the territory between them. The specific frequency she'd spent 6 months learning to read. The one that meant, "You are unreasonable, and I have no intention of changing anything about this situation." She smiled at the roses. Marco had started bringing her coffee at 7:15. She hadn't asked him to. She'd simply been in the garden every morning at 7, and Marco did the perimeter check at 7, and somewhere around the 3rd week he had appeared at the garden wall with 2 cups and set one on the stone without comment and continued his check. It was just how it was now. The other men had adjusted in their own ways, in the particular manner of people who were very good at reading which way the wind had changed and adjusting their sails accordingly. Dmitri held doors. Fen, who was terrifying in the way that very quiet, very competent men were terrifying, had once spent 40 minutes helping her identify a pest on the climbing hydrangea, and had done it with complete seriousness. Mrs. Gable had observed all of this with the satisfaction of a woman watching a garden she had planted herself come up exactly as she'd intended. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't need to. Her entire bearing said it continuously and at considerable volume. Wren, as it turned out, had experienced what Silas described, in the single, dry sentence he'd devoted to the topic, as a permanent rearrangement of his professional interests. Iris hadn't asked for details. She'd asked once, early on, whether it had been resolved cleanly. He'd looked at her with the expression he wore when he was deciding how honest to be, and then he'd said, "Cleanly enough." And she'd understood that cleanly enough was the honest answer, and that it was also the most she needed, and she'd filed it away and gone back to the garden. That was the agreement they'd arrived at without discussing it. She didn't ask for the details of his world. He didn't pretend the details didn't exist. They met somewhere in the middle, in the kitchen at odd hours, in the garden in the early morning, in the specific, comfortable shorthand of 2 people who had decided to trust each other and were building, quietly and daily, what that trust looked like in practice. It wasn't simple. She hadn't expected simple. She'd expected honest, and she'd gotten that, and it turned out honest was better. The Thornfield papers arrived on a Thursday. A courier. A sealed envelope addressed to her, not to Silas, not to the manor, but specifically to her, with a law firm's return address she didn't recognize. She opened it at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time, because the first 2 hadn't fully resolved into something her brain was prepared to accept. The Thornfield estate, the property next door, the one she'd tended for 2 seasons before the sale, the one with the greenhouses she'd loved, and the walled garden she'd mapped from memory, and the soil she still knew better than her own hands, had been acquired, restored, converted, with the planning approval attached to the letter, into a community horticultural center. Training programs for young gardeners, apprenticeships, a working nursery supplying plants to estates across the county. Her name was on the founding documents, not as a donor, not as a consultant, as director. She sat with the papers on the table in front of her for a long time. She thought about the first morning, the armchair. You'd go where? The calluses he'd looked at like they were something worth looking at. The garden he'd let go to wilderness for 2 years because the person who'd tended it was gone and he hadn't known how to make himself care about it without her. She thought about the roses, something that came back every year, something you could count on. She heard him in the hallway. The particular weight of his footsteps. She'd long since stopped needing to count them. Silas? He appeared in the kitchen doorway, jacket on, which meant he was heading out. He looked at her face,
The quick, efficient read he did, the one that had gotten more thorough over 6 months and considerably less disguised, and stopped. "What is it?" She held up the papers. He looked at them, then at her. His expression entirely neutral in the way it was neutral when he already knew what he was looking at. "You knew," she said. "I was aware of the project." Silas. "It needed a director," he said. "Someone who understood the land, someone the community would trust." A pause, brief, deliberate. "Someone who talked to the roses." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze with the complete steadiness of a man who had done something he intended to do and was prepared to stand in the consequences of it. "You could have told me," she said. "I could have." Another pause, quieter. "I wanted you to have something that was yours, that didn't come through me, that you couldn't attribute to anything other than what you are." He looked at the papers in her hand. "The documents were always going to have your name on them. I just needed you to be ready to see it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the garden was in full riot, red and white and deep blush catching the summer light. The iron archways buried under life, the paths clear and pale and properly tended. She set the papers down. She crossed the kitchen. She reached up. He was taller than made practical sense. She'd told him this. He'd found it unreasonably satisfying, and put her hand against his jaw the way she'd put it there the morning of the photograph, and the split knuckles, and the first true thing he'd said to anyone in 8 years. He turned his face into her hand, automatic, unhurried, the way he did it now, not as something considered, not as something decided in real time, but as a simple fact of where his face went when her hand was near it. She looked at him, at the man who had pulled a blanket up in the dark over a stranger and turned off the light so the light wouldn't disturb her, who had stood at a garden wall with a trowel he wasn't going to use and stayed anyway, who had sat at his kitchen table at 8 in the morning and said "Thomas" out loud for the first time in 8 years because her hands had made the room safe enough to say it in, who had put her name on a founding document and waited quietly for her to be ready to find it. "You are," she said, "the most complicated man I have ever met." "Yes," he agreed, without apology. "I'm staying," she said, "in case that continues to require clarification." Something moved through his face, deep and brief and entirely unguarded. The expression she'd first glimpsed across a kitchen table when she'd said, "The roses aren't finished," and that she now saw regularly enough to know it by heart. The specific look of a man who kept being surprised by the same thing and had given up pretending he wasn't. His hand came up and covered hers where it rested on his jaw, not moving it, not pressing it closer, just holding it there, warm and certain and completely at home. "Mrs. Gable has been telling me that for 6 months," he said. "Mrs. Gable is always right. Don't tell her I agreed with that." "She already knows," Iris said. "She knows everything." From somewhere deeper in the house came the serene sound of a crossword being completed with great satisfaction. Silas looked at the ceiling. Iris laughed. The real one, the one that was too loud for the room and always had been, the one she'd stopped apologizing for somewhere around the end of the 2nd week, and stepped into him, and his arms came around her with the ease of something that had been doing this long enough to know exactly where everything went. She rested her head against his chest. He rested his chin on top of her head. Outside the kitchen window, the garden moved in the summer breeze, the roses in full, riotous, triumphant bloom, climbing every surface available to them, covering the stone and the iron and the evidence of the years they'd spent waiting, in a cascade of red and white and deep, warm blush. Something that came back every year. Something you could count on. The clock on the kitchen wall counted out the quiet. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to.